Anybody else?
Is Gary there?
See his name.
Yeah, Aaron is not going to be at the evening session, I believe. Sheila told me, so
He's on the list, but I haven't heard him speak up.
well, let's go on with staff.
Sheila Kemmis, Commission Support.
Brad Lovelace, Secretary from Pratt.
Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary in Pratt.
Chris Tymason, Legal Counsel.
Okay, this is the time when we have welcome and encourage general public comment on non-agenda items. Is there anybody who would like to address the group on something that's not on the agenda tonight? I see one hand up. Two
We have
hands.
Ray Crow. I'll unmute you.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, sir.
I just have a comment in regards to the Kansas muzzleloader season. I visit and frequent Kansas quite often to participate in the great outdoors that Kansas has to offer. And I want to make a comment on the federal fire stick and just make it known that I think it'd be a great addition to the Kansas muzzleloader season.
Okay. Well, thank you. Is there somebody else? I saw a hand raised. Joel Hodgson.
We help.
Hello.
Good. There.
Hi, folks. Joel Hodgson here, Shawnee resident and lifelong Kansas hunter, muzzleloader hunter. I'm also calling in support of allowing the federal fire stick in this year's muzzleloading hunt. In addition to some of the reasons Ray brought up, I know that recruitment, retention, and reactivation of hunters in our state is really important. And I think one way to get more hunters buying licenses, buying tags, and outside is by allowing new technology that makes hunting safer and more effective. And in my mind, Fire Stick definitely falls under that bucket. I think it's a great product and something I'd like to use myself this fall. So I'd encourage you all as a commission to take another look at it and consider allowing for the hunting season. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Is there other public comment?
You have one that sent an email in earlier, and then I talked to him and texted him in the break. It's a Terry. Let me get the email up so I make sure I pronounce his name right. It's Terry Showalter, and he just wanted to voice his concern, see if that you guys had talked about if the commission had actually talked about anything with during air gun hunting for deer hunting. He made sure to make sure it was going to be of course it had to be over a .0357 caliber, but him and his friends thought it would be a nice idea to add to deer season for that, and so I wanted to make sure I passed that along to you.
Okay. Have we had for this coming year, we already had the regulations in effect have we already passed those for the coming year?
No,
Okay.
it's on tonight in the workshop.
All right. Any other public comment? If not, Chris is going to talk about landowner and tenant deer permits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Miller had asked that I do a short bit on the landowner and tenant deer permits. So to start in your briefing book, I had 32-937, KSA 32-937 placed in the briefing book. That is what dictates largely how our permitting scheme works in Kansas. Unlike other species, deer is dictated in statute. It sets out permit allocations and permit types. Nowhere else does that occur for upland birds or waterfowl or anything like that. So it's kind of unique. And to go back in the history, I saw that Keith Sexton was on earlier, and Keith is largely responsible for the existence of that statute. I see that he's on now too. So, that statute came about in the late 80s. As deer populations rose, folks wanted to have a landowner guaranteed type of permit. And so they came to the old Fish and Game Commission and then came to the legislature and got the first statute written. Over that time, there have been a couple additions and renditions to the statute. Most notably, in 2010, Mike Miller convened a task force, and I was on that task force, and we looked at those statutes and tried to come up with a system that would try to satisfy as many constituents as possible. And when we did that, we took what was basically, I'm using Mike's words, he can step in, but it was a house that was a small one-room house and was added onto over the years. And then we tried to take it down to the studs and then rebuild it. And so a lot of the language that's there today was originally there. And then we added in a few other things, but every year we get some confusion about landowners and tenants and who can qualify for what type of permit. And so if you'll follow along in the briefing book on the statutes, the first section I'll talk about is just the landowner. And what is a landowner? And it's subsection A1 right at the top there. And a landowner means a resident owner of farm or ranch land of 80 acres or more located in the state of Kansas. And what does that mean? So they don't say resident landowner, they say landowner. And they make a distinction later in the statute and say non-resident landowner. So it's just landowners and non-resident landowners. A landowner is somebody whose name is on the deed, okay? So if your name is not on the deed, somebody owns the piece of property. The landowner is the person whose name is on the deed. It talks about individuals because permits cannot be issued to corporations. Permits are issued to individuals. So the next section I'll send you to is non-resident landowners, right? And it is subsection A6. Again, that's a person whose name is on the deed. Those non-resident landowners, according to these statutes, qualify for a hunt your own land permit. It's a guaranteed permit as a landowner to be able to hunt your own property. In basic terms, you have to have 80 acres per permit, per individual receiving a permit if their name is on the deed. So if Secretary Lovelace and I owned 160 acres and we were non-residents, both of our names were on the deed, it's an undivided interest in that 160 acres, and we would each qualify under the 80-acre clause for a permit. That also goes for residents as well. 80 acres per person who's getting a guaranteed permit. The next section I'll point you to, and this is probably the most difficult section that we have when it comes to interpreting the statutes is subsection A2, and it's tenants. And there is no distinction between a resident and a non-resident tenant. And there's a reason for that. And that's, I think when it was originally envisioned, tenancy, it was somebody who was farming who lived close to the border. They might farm on both sides of the border. As we all know today, land ownership has changed, and people might live in states or clear across the country. And so a tenant could still be a tenant living in Maine and qualify under the statutes for a permit because they own the land in another entity, another legal entity. And common ones are partnerships and trusts. Most commonly today, the limited liability corporation, an LLC. And that is how people would, they might not be a landowner. They've placed it into a limited liability corporation for a number of reasons, to protect themselves from suit or for tax purposes. They don't own that piece of property. It's owned by another legal entity, and they are the manager of that entity. And so again, a tenant, you go back to the 80 acres, it's 80 acres or more of farm or ranch land that they're actively engaged in the operation of. And then there's a clause, an and clause, and who has a substantial financial interest in the production of agricultural commodities on such land and the potential to realize the benefit, or is a bona fide manager having overall responsibility. So if I live in Maine and I direct my tenant I might subcontract or contract my tenant, the farming duties. So I could still, even as a landowner, manager of the LLC, could still qualify for a permit because I'm managing my employees or my contractors on how they operate on that property. And I think that, originally it was put in there for those cross-border situations that we would commonly think about. But it also is, while it's specific in some of those regards in what it states, it's also general enough that it allows those other opportunities for people who might inherit a piece of property and then they put it into their LLC and then live in Missouri or Illinois and come here to hunt. I do believe it causes some problems for our enforcement folks, because what is a substantial financial investment for one might not be for another person. And so that can be difficult, but evidence of tenancy, written leases, we would hope people are using written leases so you could have evidence of tenancy. Also your income tax, your farm records, things like that. If it's a legitimate farm, people are going to they're doing it for those income tax benefits. One thing about tenants, the fees are different. We do differentiate between resident and non-resident tenants when it comes to fees. We charge them the exact same amount that we would charge a non-resident landowner. A non-resident tenant pays that same amount. And the same with a resident tenant, they would pay the same amount as a resident landowner. And then one last thing to note, tenants, so residents who are landowners, their children who reside with them qualify for a hunt your own land permit. Non-resident landowners do not. It's slightly different. And it's just a differentiation in the statute. But if you're a tenant and you're a non-resident, the children who reside in your home that you're legally responsible for, they could qualify as long as you have that 80 acres or more. You can see it's a little complex. Every year we get questions. We also every year get people who are trying to manipulate the system to see if they can qualify. And those are probably the bigger questions that rise to my level. Quite often I get contacted by people who are looking at purchasing property, want to make sure that they're doing the right thing. I typically respond to them and say, you have an attorney who's going to be working on this project for you. Have the attorney contact me, and I can have an attorney to attorney conversation without providing individual personal legal advice to somebody. Generally, in a nutshell, that's it when it comes to landowner and tenant permits. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Chris, Gerald, I have a question. Can a non-resident landowner buy a special hunt your own land deer permit as described in AH?
Okay, so the special non-resident hunt your own land permit is available to resident landowners, but we call them resident landowners, or to tenants. So it could be a resident or non-resident tenant. It's for their children that might reside out of state and want to come. And they have to have a non-resident hunting license, and then they get this special hunt your own land deer permit.
Okay.
That was one of the biggest complaints in the 2008 when we did this. One of the bigger complaints, I should say, was non-residents who had a connection to a family farm or had gone to college and then ultimately stayed out of state. How could we accommodate those people that have that familial tie to the ground without upsetting the balance of resident and non-resident permits? And so we came up with this idea to try to solve that.
Even though it says landowner, landowner can be either resident or non-resident landowner.
In the statute where it refers to landowner and does not say non-resident landowner before it, if it just says landowner, it refers to a resident.
So a non-resident landowner would not be able to buy a special hunt your own land deer permit.
Yes, so the landowner or the tenant, resident or non-resident, they're not actually the person buying the permit. It's their children, their lineal ascendants or descendants. So if I had, even if my father lived in Minnesota and I was a resident landowner of 80 acres or more, and I had plenty of land that met that 80-acre requirement per permit, my father would be the one who's actually purchasing that special hunt your own land permit. He's doing it tied to my land.
If your father lived in Minnesota and had 80 acres, could he buy a permit or have your brother buy a special permit if he's a non-resident?
I'm sorry, say that scenario again, please.
Find out if the fee simple title is in the name of a non-resident, can their non-resident children apply for a special hunt your own land permit?
No.
Okay.
Non-resident landowners do not qualify. Their children do not qualify for this permit.
All right. Warren?
Yeah. Warren Geffeller. Chris, why wouldn't your taxpayer status determine whether you're a resident or non-resident? If you're a resident taxpayer, you're a resident. If you're a non-resident taxpayer on income from Kansas, you're a non-resident.
So it's where you live, right? And I understand your point, but it's where your domicile is. That's what dictates your residency.
Well, and a resident taxpayer would have a Kansas residence, right?
Yes.
And
I don't know that that's 100% true, but I think in most cases, a resident would have their residence here. I can think of military folks might not because they're living out of state, but their home of record is still Kansas. And so they're still paying Kansas taxes. These are complex issues. The most simple would be if you live in our state, you get a resident permit. If you live in another state, you get a non-resident permit. But we have to have ways. We made that decision in the 80s to accommodate landowners. And then from there, it's just been built. That's the direction that we went as a state.
Commissioner Silt. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Warren.
Go ahead.
It's Commissioner Silt. So in the 80s, we were still, all residents were on a draw. And it makes sense that a portion of those permits should have gone to landowners, given the amount of private land we have. But when residents are over-the-counter tags, I don't understand the need for landowner tenant tags. I do understand hunt your own land tags. But in a sense, landowners and tenants are getting a break just because they own land. For that reason alone, they're getting a break in how much they pay for a deer permit that they're going to use on state land or someone else's land. And that violates, to me, one of the ethical principles in that of those 7 tenets of the North American model, and that's the democracy of hunting. We're giving preference to landowner tenants. That bothers me because things changed when we went over the counter. And this should have changed then, and it wouldn't be the muddy mess that it is if that hadn't happened. It would be nice in my mind if we could have resident tags and hunt your own land tags, your non-resident tags, but the landowner tenant thing's a pickle.
Well, this is Gerald. I agree the need doesn't necessarily seem to be there, and somebody who owns land in one county can apply for a landowner tenant price and that permit is good everywhere. Politically, it's going to be difficult to push that through the legislature because there's a push against deer haters that we should be able to get them free anyway because we feed them. I'd rather leave that alone, although I agree with what you're saying.
I want to point out,
I
this
don't know
is
if I
Chris.
want to have that fight.
I understand.
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason. I want to point out that since 2008, prior to 2008, we had a lot of legislative angst over permits and deer damage. And I've had lots of legislators over the last 12 years, 13 years comment that the system is much better. Again, this is a house that was cobbled onto over many, many years, over 45 years at the time. And the objective of the task force was to attempt to simplify things as much as possible for people, and an any season permit did that, and a statewide permit, and that also keeping in mind to protect the resource, things that wouldn't damage the resource. And hunt your own land permits are important if you live in the West and have mule deer and no whitetails on your property. And so there were a lot of things that were considered that task force met for over a year, and I think came out with a very good product that seems to satisfy about 98% of all people. And I'd be happy to entertain comments from Mike. He was on that task force as well.
Well, I would say the other thing we did on that task force is we wanted to get rid of the transferable permit. And so we were trying to accommodate landowners by removing the transferable permit. We knew that we were impacting resident opportunities with additional non-resident permits. And so we want residents to have more flexibility. That's why the statewide permit came about, to give them the flexibility. You know, the statistics showed most people hunted close to home, but it did give them more flexibility. And in reference to what Lauren's point, I don't disagree with you, Commissioner Sill, but I think we've always given landowners a break because of potential deer damage, that we want them to accommodate the deer. They do provide the habitat and the food for the deer. And I think that sentiment has never gone away with those half-price permits. It would be simpler if we just had resident, non-resident, unowned land. I agree.
I understand. I can accept that. It's this Commissioner Cell. It does get just a bit confusing for folks, and complexity when we're looking for simplicity other places. It's complex. I do understand some of those reasons behind it.
Commissioner Spore, Chris, how's staff proven ownership and tenants' rights to hunt? Are you guys requiring any documentation?
So, Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, in relation to law enforcement and how they prove, I think when I started with the department, people used to have to fill out a sheet and that gave marked down their tenancy and their ownership and had to carry around. I remember some friends that I deer hunted with, a giant sheet of paper. And then I think it might have been the first year I was here when Secretary Williams was the secretary, and they made a decision at that point to do away with that requirement. In the mid 2010s, early 2010s, there was some concern from some folks that there was fraudulent activity, and we came up with a plan that law enforcement would check 25% of the hunt your own land or landowner tenant permits and start doing some random stuff on the back end. We had no expectation that folks who were selling the licenses in locations that we didn't control would be enforcing that. We didn't want to put it on the bait shop that you went to buy your deer permit. Also, you have to understand where we came from and where we are with deer populations. A lot of those changes came as deer populations rose significantly in the late 90s. More availability of permits. I believe you used to have to go into one of our offices to get a hunt your own land permit, and then they became an over-the-counter permit. So we do have ways to check those. We do check those. We randomly spot check them. So, and then when you can always go back and then reference land records and FSA documents and tax records and things like that.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Brad Lovelace, Secretary. So a year ago, I was out with some members of the department on a Saturday chasing pheasants, and we got checked by one of our law enforcement officers and had a great conversation. At the end, I asked him, "What can we do to make you more efficient or effective in your job?" And he said, "Boy, simplify these deer regs, right?" So everybody wants to do the same thing, but our law enforcement folks have a unique perspective because they're the ones out in the field, and Chris works hard to help them manage this, but they're the ones that are tasked with navigating this and doing a good job, and they want to do a perfect job every time. So we have Greg Kaiser, who's our acting colonel, and might you be willing to listen to Greg comment on this, Chairman?
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm Greg Kaiser, interim colonel for the law enforcement division. Lifelong Kansan. When I grew up, I remember, it was much simplified than what it is now. It's extremely difficult for the people within the law enforcement division to deal with this. When we're sitting here right now trying to decipher all this, I mean, it's difficult for my people out in the field. Probably the biggest thing is the tenant situation. That I think that's where you have a lot of people trying to skirt the system, and they don't have a real financial interest in the agricultural aspect of it. And they're it's like, well, I take care of the fence, okay, or we see that all the time. Just it's really hard to explain. We've got a lot of people coming from out of state just coming to buy deer property, and we see a lot of the tenant situations, and it just makes it very difficult for my people to try to enforce that. So that would be my thing. If we could at least do away with the tenant aspect of it and just make it landowner, that would help.
Warren?
A question, what is the downside of doing that? Why couldn't we just eliminate the tenant provision?
Well, I can tell you that, Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymonson again. Those folks who have a land in LLC wouldn't be able to hunt their property unless they got a general permit.
But what if a member of an LLC would qualify? I mean, that's a real simple solution, is just to be a member of an LLC and maybe limit the number of members.
Again, then they're not the tenant. The LLC is the owner of the property, right, or the tenant, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chris. If you eliminate the tenant provision and just have a landowner provision, in case of an LLC that owns land, members of that LLC would be landowners, not tenants. Eliminate that connection there. Is there a downside to that?
You have to go back to the basis of we don't issue permits to tenant, or we don't issue permits to non-individual legal entities.
But could we, if we change the regs, or is that a legislative change?
It's a statutory change.
Okay.
And so I think that you run some real serious risk taking this statute into the legislature.
I concur with that. I understand what Colonel Kaiser says, but law enforcement does a reasonable job in ferreting out those that are gaming the system. I really would hate to try to tell the legislature that we want to eliminate tenants, whether or not it really hurts anybody or not. The theory would cause a lot of legislators just to jump up in the air and have an instant gut reaction of big negative. I'm nervous to take that into them. Troy?
This is Commissioner Spohr. It seems pretty simple to me when we go register a vehicle, what do we have to have? Proof of insurance before they'll sell us or give us our tag. If you went to landowner tenant tags and only did it online, and they had to provide the deed and either a W-2 or a 1099 for the tenant, and then paid staff and Pratt could visit all this and then allow the tag. It's hard for me to believe that you can walk into a bait shop and buy a landowner tenant tag and be legal in Kansas. I could see the problem with law enforcement. And then are they really on the right piece of land? So,
well,
my thoughts.
Landowner tenant, if you're a resident, you don't have to hunt on your own land.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
So there is the balance of availability of permits and trying to be customer friendly. There is some fraud, and I think as a basic premise, you also have to understand there's fraud in every system, no matter what. It doesn't matter what you do or how you have it, there will be some sort of fraud. Law enforcement does a great job in making sure that the complaints that we receive or the random checks that we have, catching up to those individuals. There are individuals who legitimately own land and end up buying the wrong permit because they don't understand the legal entity part. And those are the people that we try to help, and the people who say they fix fence and that makes them a tenant, we catch. But there will always be fraud no matter what we do in every system.
Commissioner
I've never-
Still,
Yes,
is there a way that we can better educate people? Some of this is by mistake. Some of it is, I see in our local sporting goods store, if you ask the cashiers and you go in, they say, yeah, everybody owns 80 acres anymore. They know there's a high level of fraud that they see from the people they know. Is there not a way we can do some education? And I don't have a good suggestion, but a pamphlet when they buy their tag, I don't know. But part of this is ignorance, part of it's fraud. Perhaps some education might help with a portion of it.
I would say anything we could do other than try to bring this back for statutory amendment. Warren?
Well, I was just going to agree with Commissioner Sill, this Warren Gefeller, but it seems to me that it's so confusing, and I think maybe, Chris, that's what you're trying to communicate. This thing has evolved over a number of years where we tried to accommodate this issue and that issue, and that doesn't fit together very well, and there is a lot of confusion, and a lot of confusion results in unintended fraud or unintended wrongdoing. But then there's also it because it's confusing, it makes it more difficult to identify fraud. So, if the discussion is, would we like to see you bring some proposals that would simplify the thing and tighten up definitions? Well, I'm all for that. There's all kinds of suggestions I've heard from people, and I just don't know how many of them are statutory changes and how many of them we can do. But, for example, the 80-acre deal, from what I understand and people tell me, is, if there's 16 heirs that are a party to that 80 acres and they're all non-residents, you get 16 permits potentially. So, if that's true, and I don't know that it is. Go ahead.
I don't think that's true. I think you get one permit per 80 acres.
That's what my understanding was, but people don't understand that. And I'm sure there's situations out there where we've got two permits issued per 80 acres. But I'm all for simplification, and I'm all for streamlining it, and I'm all for listening to what law enforcement has to say about what would make their job easier. But I don't know that I have any good solutions at the moment.
Mike?
Mr. Chairman, Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary in Pratt. I think this came out of the law enforcement division. It's a suggestion that maybe mirrors what Iowa does, that is to have a landowner tenant registry with the department. So a landowner or a tenant that would qualify for a landowner tenant permit would register one time with the department with proof that they owned land or they had enough acres to qualify. And then from then on, they'd be in our system and could purchase a landowner tenant permit. I think that's how Iowa does it. I don't know the logistics of that type of a program, but it's a potential that would take some of the burden off of law enforcement. It wouldn't allow somebody to just go into Walmart and say, yeah, I own 80 acres. I want a landowner tenant permit. They'd have to be in the system as a landowner or tenant to be able to qualify.
And we would not have to bring it before the legislature.
I don't think so. I'd have to defer to Chris.
Well, that's a thought to be looked into.
I would, Mr. Chairman, if I could, I would take you back to the beginning of my comments and the task force that Mike and I were on. And Mike and I were in the legislature actually working that bill, and we attempted to, I think statutory constraints, statutory language is constraining. And in order to be flexible and nimble, regulatory language that you all vote on is obviously a much quicker method to getting things done. It might seem like it takes, a lot of time, but compared to statutory enactments, it's much shorter. And when we proposed, we came up with this plan. We worked on it for over a year with the members of this task force. We went around the state. After we had a finished product, we talked about it with people. We made some tweaks to it. And then we went to the legislature. And essentially we were going to try to get rid of this statute. That was our proposal, was to get rid of this statute and say, we're going to enact what is in this written plan in regulation. And the legislature came back and said, certain members of the legislature, we don't trust you. Put it all in statute. So that's that's the reality of it is, while we would like to be a little more nimble and flexible on some things and work on things that are problematic, we have what we have, and we have to work within those bounds.
Commissioner Sill, are you saying that we can't pursue something like Mike has just mentioned?
No, I didn't.
Registry?
Chris Tymason again. No, I did not say that.
Okay.
That's certainly something we can entertain. I'm just pointing out the difficulty when people say we should get rid of things or do things. Sometimes it's a lot harder than it appears. We almost lost our entire body of work over one legislative meeting. It was pretty tenuous at the time. So if that's it.
Commissioner Sill, I realize that and I appreciate that. I don't want to underestimate the challenges of the legislative issues and things. I'm just pretty sensitive to the Kansas resident hunters and the situations that they've mentioned to us, and want to be an advocate for them. And am just trying to pursue us to think and encourage us to think about what other options are there when some of these sticky things make a mess. And I know that makes it difficult for law enforcement, and they're pretty important. Otherwise, our regulations aren't worth much if we don't have some help on that end of things.
Okay. Any more questions on this topic?
Commissioner Lauber, we do have one public with his hand rose. If we can let Commissioner Warren go, and then we can talk to Jason Wenzel.
We might let him go. Mr. Chairman, all I was going to ask is where we go from here, but we'll let the public have a comment.
Okay. I'll unmute you, Jason.
I think I don't know where we go from here. Wait for staff to make recommendations, I think.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
This is Jason Wenzel, Wichita KPA member. I just put in the chat. It seems like we're trying to, or it appears that we're trying to possibly reinvent the wheel. And I was wondering if there might be some other states, nearby states that might have successfully navigated this process as a model to consider. And that's all I have.
Okay. Thank you. We'll take that into consideration. Let's move on. KAR 115-25-9A, Levi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Levi Jaster, Emporia, Kansas. 115-25-9A is the deer seasons on our military facilities in Kansas, Smoky Hill, A&G, Fort Riley, and Fort Leavenworth. We do these separately to allow some flexibility with their planning for their needs, to push this as late as we can so that if they do have a big change, that can be addressed with this. Also, because of those needs, they sometimes need some alternate dates to our statewide seasons. And so to get into what differences they're asking for, Smoky Hill A&G is requesting to have the same seasons as the state in their as Unit 4, where they're located. Fort Riley wants the same seasons as the state, with the following exceptions. They want additional archery days for individuals authorized by Fort Riley. That would be September 1st through the 12th, and then January 1st through the 31st in 2022. They want additional days of hunting for designated persons, which would be youth and disabilities, October 9th through the 11th. And then that would take the place of the pre-rut firearms antlerless whitetail season on the fort. So no October pre-rut season. And then the firearms season dates of November 26th through the 28th, December 18th through the 23rd, and December 26th through the 28th of 2021. That's the same number of days as the statewide season, just different dates. And then they do not want to have a extended firearms antlerless only season in January. Fort Leavenworth has requested the same dates as the statewide seasons, with the exceptions of the open firearms season would be November 13th through the 14th, November 20th through the 21st, November 25th through the 28th, December 4th through the 5th, and December 11th through the 12th. Again, that's the same number of days as the statewide season, just different days that they would allow firearms deer hunting on Fort Leavenworth. They also would like the extended firearms season for antlerless only whitetail deer to be January 1st through the 23rd, 2022. And an extended archery season for antlerless only whitetail deer from January 24th through the 31st, 2022. And then on Fort Riley, they only want to allow one antlerless whitetail deer permit to be used. And I have a slight correction of what's in the briefing book. Fort Leavenworth has that they want to use up to 5 antlerless whitetail deer permits, and Smoky Hill A&G also requested to be able to use up to 5 antlerless whitetail deer permits, in which is the same as the Unit 4, which they're located within. And so those are the proposed dates for the military facilities in Kansas. And so that's just the introduction to it. And we'll go forward and workshop this a couple more times, with eventually we'll do the public hearing in June to set the military facility seasons. And so that wraps up the 125 or 115.25 9A. And I will take questions if there are any.
Anybody have any questions for Levi on this? We pretty much let the military installations call their own shots. All right, go on, Levi, to the next one.
All right, that would be Levi Jasper, Emporia, Kansas. That's the workshop. I have a last minute addition to this that we need to address. because of the inclusion of e-tags. And I will share my screen here. So in 115 1-1, the definitions, in number 63, where we list transfer, item C there that's highlighted is to carry another individual's license, permit, or other issue of the department when that individual is not present. We are wanting to strike that out of that definition, because with e-tags, if somebody else holds a separate account on a phone, such as maybe I would hold the account for the e-tags on my phone for my wife, or a parent for children, we've basically made them be illegal. And so just striking that would be the change. And so that would be the change of the definition there. So I guess if you've got questions, I would take those.
Now this is on the 115.4.
It follows that it affects the definitions in 115.4. This is 115.1-1.
All right.
And this was only brought to my attention yesterday.
Okay.
So potentially, I don't know if Chris has any comments on this or not.
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, that's actually an issue that was raised by law enforcement, pointing out that as we went to electronic licensing, some folks could be unwittingly, unlawfully in possession of somebody else's permit. That's the purpose for the change.
Okay. And that's all we have on 115-4.
Levi Jasper report. No, there's more in 115.4 to do.
Okay. That was all right. That was 115.4-2, or that was 1.1.
That was 1.1.
All right. Now you're going to 4.2.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So Levi Jasper Emporia, this is the 115.4-2 regulations, big game permanent regulations. 115.4-2 is our general provisions. Last year we modified proof of sex regulations for antlerless deer and elk to allow hunters to voluntarily help prevent spreading chronic wasting disease by leaving parts of carcasses in the field. And additionally, we made some recent changes with allowing e-tagging of big game. And so currently with that regulation, there's no changes proposed.
Okay.
So I will move on to 115.4-4, which is big game legal equipment and taking methods. Last meeting, we discussed large caliber air guns for big game hunting equipment, and the federal fire stick system as a potential muzzleloading equipment. And so far, right now it stands, we're not proposing any changes for this regulation.
Okay, I have a question. And in your discussion, you make a good point about large caliber air guns not being part of Pittman Robertson, so on and so forth. But in your discussion about the fire stick, one would almost assume that the department was in favor of this, because the discussion is cause it provides a lot of the benefits that the fire stick has. And but you're saying that you don't recommend the use of the fire stick?
Levi Jaster in Emporia, Kansas. Where we left off last time is that the department did not have a biological reason to support or oppose placing the fire stick in muzzleloading equipment. And so I think it, if I recall correctly, the commission decided to let it go for then.
Okay. That's probably the case. I think we're going to be reviewing fire sticks every year from now on. And there may not be much support for it, but I don't know if any commissioner has any other thoughts on this. I know, well, I think we have kicked it around. Is there any other thoughts on that by any of the other commissioners? Well, then go ahead, Levi.
All right.
Commissioner Lauber.
Yes.
This is Jason, CIO. Is there public comment on that, or is that towards the end? We've got some people in the chat wanting to make some comments on the fire stick stuff.
I just as soon talk about it now.
Okay. I have a John Zinnel who will unmute here.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? This is John. Perfect. So John Zinnel, again, I know I spoke with the commission and the group here multiple times. I represent and work for Federal Ammunition, which of course is the manufacturer of the fire stick system. So I, again, just wanted to I guess, give our thoughts and opinions on there as far as the support of a look at the regulation and update for the fire stick system. We have had several other states that have already made the change for 2021. Your neighbors in Missouri have updated their regs, and they'll go into dockets in the middle of February. And so then they'll be ready to roll for the 2021 season. And a bill in Minnesota and Indiana is open for public comment right now, as well as Texas and Alabama and Florida and many other states. So just as far as we're concerned, and I know I can speak on behalf of Traditions and Hodgson Powder, some partners of ours within this project, that we obviously do support it and appreciate the opportunity previous to this, and of course today, your time to just voice our opinion on the support of the system.
Okay, thank you. Is there any more comments from the public?
We have some in the chat, and they're kind of long, so I'm just gonna I'll pass them along to everyone in the chat so you guys can read through them. I don't want to mess them up by trying to read them myself.
Yeah, Gerald, this is Commissioner Spohr. The whole concept of firearms, deer season, and that's what we used to have was black powder, and then we started shooting long rifles, and now black powder is just like long rifle. I mean, you could go either way. You could say, well, we're going to stop the evolution, or you can get in line and just go with it and let them have fire sticks. I guess I don't know as a commissioner which way to go on it. I guess you could say, well, if everybody wants to have a fire stick, let them have a fire stick. So I guess I guess that's why a lot of the commissioners are quiet about it is we just really don't know.
Commissioner Sill, one of my concerns, and I realize that now there are people that from the public that are speaking up, but when we have manufacturers and their representatives that request regulatory change to promote a product. I think that sets a precedent that I'm uncomfortable with.
Any other comments?
Oh, no, sorry, Commissioner Lauber, I got one more. Let me, Joel, I will unmute you here.
Good evening, folks. And Commissioner Sill, just wanted to address your comment. I think specifically, to acknowledge that, yes, my family business has done some work to bring this product to market. But I would say that, we are first and foremost Kansas residents and Kansas hunters. And so as an individual, as a hunter, I'm not here to speak on behalf of my family or our company. I'm here to speak on behalf of myself and on using a product that I generally believe is safer and more effective. But I certainly see your point and just wanted to address that. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments?
I think that's it.
Okay, Levi, go on.
All right, Levi Jaster, Emporia. The next one is 115-4-6, which is our management units. And we had a couple things that came back from the Department of Administration. Just some updates to this. So I want to share my screen again. All right. So we've discussed the changes to DMU 19. That is the federal highway US 73 to the Kansas-Missouri state line. That would change to the federal highway US 73 to the to the state highway K92, and then K92 to the Kansas-Missouri state line. Map to show that section of that unit. And then there's the change, and that's changes because the unit wasn't a complete polygon using US 73. But then a couple other changes are just to update the names of roads that are boundaries. So the one that would affect management unit 5 and 17 is changing the name of Federal Highway US 156. That's now State Highway K 156. And then a name change for management unit 10 and 11. It was State Highway K 150, and that is now Johnson County 135th Street. And then on the unit 19 boundary, the road was listed as South Topeka Boulevard, and now that is would be South Topeka Avenue. So just an update of those road names that have changed over time. The boundaries aren't actually moving, save that one little change with up there to get to the state line. Other than that, it's just updating the names in our regulations. So I can take questions on that.
Any questions for Levi? Okay, Levi.
All right. The next one that's on was 115-4-13, which is our description or deer permits. Chris gave a very nice talk about the landowner tenant permits. So far with this, we're not changing any, we're not proposing any changes. We will be continuing to not issue any either species antlerless only permits like we've done in the past few years because of concern with mule deer. And so that would conclude the 115-4 series of big game regulations.
Any questions for Levi on any of those? Okay, move on.
All right, Levi Jaster Emporia. This would bring up the Deer 25 series, which sets our seasons and our dates. And so one thing that kind of ties back to what we discussed in the afternoon session with the youth is considering a change to the youth and disabled season, the designated person seasons for deer. Currently, it's the 16 years of age or younger, and we potentially, as Jake showed, there's several options. One to consider is if we go to hunters 17 years of age or younger, so under 18. And I tried to throw some numbers together just to show what that would affect during the break. So I will share my screen again. Okay. So this, just to kind of run through the numbers, if we change from 16 and under to under 17, so this is the 2019 season data. So just looking at that, there were hunters that were born in 2003, which would make them 16 in 2019. There are about 10,500, almost 10,600 of those hunters. Some of those hunters probably turned 17 before the season because assuming that anybody that qualified for a youth permit bought a youth permit. Those that were 16 and under that had a youth permit was 8,900, almost 9,000. Whereas the number of hunters that were 17 that year total was almost 1,500, 1,477. And then assuming that births are pretty even across the year, which isn't quite true. But if you had to be 17 before or would have turned 17 during, or it would give you about 977 that wouldn't be able to, or would have been able to hunt. So potentially that change would affect about 2,600 hunters. But I also wanted to show that based on our estimates that, participation in youth season was about 1,500 total youth participated in youth season that year. So 1,500 hunters. Some of those are likely disabled hunters too. But just to kind of get an idea of how that would affect affect hunters if we changed to add a year of eligibility there. After that, it would be our January antlerless only, whitetail antlerless only seasons. We're considering 9 days, 16 days, and 23 days. And that will be, we're going to look at our population, previous harvest to determine what units those would necessarily fall within those. And so that would give us, take us to our dates. And so the proposed dates for The 2021 to 2022 seasons would be the youth and disabled season would be September 4th through September 12th of 2021. The early muzzleloader season would start on the 13th and run to September 26th. Archery season would also open on September 13th and run until December 31st, 2021. The pre-rut whitetail antlerless only season would occur in October 9th through October 11th. And the regular firearm season would be December 1st through December 12th. The first extended whitetail antlerless only season would be January 1st of 2022 through January 9th, 2022. The second extended season would be January 1st, 2022 through January 16th, 2022. And the third extended would be January 1st, 2022 through January 23rd, 2022. And then the extended archery season, which right now is only in DMU 19, would be January 24th, 2022 through January 31st, 2022. And so that is the proposed season dates for deer this coming year. And I'll take questions if there are any.
Any questions for Levi? Well, you must be pretty thorough because there's no questions. Surely nobody's getting sleepy. Okay, thank you, Levi. That concludes our agenda. There is no public hearing tonight. Is there any other business we need to set, any meeting dates or anything? Are they pretty much set?
We have to pick a location. I'm sorry, we have to pick a location for June.
Wichita?
All right, with me.
Oh, yeah, I mean, we haven't had one there in a while. Hopefully we'll be back to live meetings by then, but, or a hybrid.
Well, what are we gonna do for March? Are we going to, I have a location in Topeka, but we need to
I
decide.
know we have a location in Topeka, but I suspect we'll still need to do a virtual meeting in March.
Okay,
I see a nod, Secretary Lovelace. I just don't think we're going to be out of the woods yet, and maybe not for the next 2 or 3, but we'll see.
okay, so I'll dump the location and we'll go to virtual.
I would.
March, Mr. Chair,
March.
Brad Lovelace from Pratt. I think you're absolutely right for March. For June, Sheila, do we have to make a financial commitment for that location in Wichita?
Depends on where we choose. Some require a deposit, some don't. Depends on what we choose. If we go to the nature center, which we normally do when we go to Wichita, we don't pay because our offices are they don't charge us.
Mr. Chair, I recommend that we focus on that location to give us maximum flexibility and to save money, and it'll be easy to get out of that commitment if you want to go totally virtual for that June meeting.
The problem with going to live meetings is that the virtual meetings are working pretty well.
Right.
In fact, they're working better than I would have ever thought. We're getting a lot more public communication, public input, and I'm not sure that they aren't more effective.
Mr. Chair, I heard you missed me. It's the problem.
True.
Maybe not. So the hybrid, as you've discussed, I know before, seems to be a really nice option to consider well into the future.
Yeah, I think so too. That's going to put a little extra work on Jason, but he's up to the task.
He's got broad shoulders, sir.
Yeah, we've actually been going through some different scenarios in IT on how we would perform that hybrid form anyway. So we're working on the problem as we speak.
All right. Is there anybody else that has anything for the good of the order? Christopher?
Mr. Chairman, Sheila, would you mind going over the dates, please, that we've set so far?
We have March 25th, which is now virtual. We have April 29th, which we have Beloit as the location. And June 17th now for Wichita.
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason again. Could we
Yes.
please set the August date?
Do you have a recommendation?
I do not, Mr. Chairman. It used to be that we pushed August as late as possible in order to get our hunting regs out. I think that has changed. Mike, would you comment on that?
Mr. Chairman, Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary. Actually, we wanted it earlier so that if there were any things that would be settled or voted on in that meeting, we would have them in time to get the hunting regs printed and out by September 1. So depending on how things go through the summer, the earlier in August is better for the hunting reg situation.
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, that would be August the 5th or the 12th then, based on Mike's recommendation.
I have
Want
a,
to do August 5th?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, Warren had something to say there.
well, Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say I have a conflict on the 12th, so the 5th would work.
Let's do the 5th.
That was August.
Yes. Okay.
Sheila, I might say we go ahead and book the Great Plains Nature Center now, just so we have that date.
I will do it.
Okay.
Troy?
Oh, I'm wanting to go back to the influx of out-of-state hunters on our public lands. And I guess several questions come up about, what we're going to do. I just don't think that we want to go through another year like we had this year. I've written down a lot of things about, and it's things that we can do. We can reduce our limits. I think our Canadian goose limit at 6 is too much. I think it ought to be at 3. I think reducing our non-resident waterfowl hunters to a certain number of days. I think we need to not allow non-residents the ability to purchase youth or veteran hunts. The idea of allowing them to hunt our public lands for an additional fee is also an option. And I guess the question to Chris is it even possible to increase the out-of-state hunting licenses through the legislature?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, I'll have to look at the caps. So we are capped in statute at a certain level, and then we raise those fees through regulation within that cap. I don't have it right in front of me specifically. We can certainly, I'll look at after we get off to see what level we're at currently versus that cap. If we have capped out, then we would have to raise those fee caps in statute in the legislature. And that's a bill that we've been talking about for several years because on some of those fees, we hit the caps in 2015. I don't know
Yes.
specifically about non-resident hunting licenses. Mr. Secretary, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, all I would offer is we have been working and met a fair amount of resistance in the legislature. My perception, Chris, you can comment on this, is that most of the resistance is around any thought, however modest, of resident increases. It seems like they aren't nearly so concerned about non-resident increases. Has that been your experience, Chris?
Yes. I also, Chris Tymason, sorry. Also, there are legal constraints as to the constitutionality of setting fees and resident and non-resident disparities that have to be kept in mind as well. It's not, we can't just price non-residents exceedingly high compared to what residents are.
Right.
Do we,
10-to-1 ratio is an acceptable standard. And that goes back to litigation in the 1970s with Montana that went to the United States Supreme Court. So, and then there's some other Commerce Clause litigation that occurred in the early 2000s, which Kansas actually was part of some lawsuits then. And so we have to balance all that when we take a look at what we could go and say increase non-residents, for example.
as a general, Gerald here, as a general rule, you raise pricing to reduce volume. But I'm not sure if we raise pricing a little bit, whether or not that's going to solve the problem. If the hunting's that good, they may pay it.
Well, this is Commissioner Spohr. You know, us as the commissioners and paid staff with the agency, you know, we can ask ourselves, do we want quality or do we want quantity? And what's going to happen around us is Missouri and Oklahoma and Nebraska are going to tighten up their out-of-state regs. And we sit on our hands and don't do something to tighten up our out-of-state regs and our problems that we're having with all the pressure. Guess what's going to happen next year? We're going to get them all. And I am deeply concerned with other states tightening up their regs to help with this problem that we've had this year. And then we don't do anything, and then we get it all. I'm very concerned. I guess I would even step out on a line and say pheasants need to go to 3 and quail need to go to 6. I'm not afraid as a commissioner to say that. You know, we've been plowing around with poor upland game numbers for years. And maybe we need to start thinking about some of that.
Well, I understand, and I'm not against it. I just don't know if raising the prices is going to solve the problem as much as just restricting the numbers. And I don't know how you restrict the numbers. At least you don't have the issues of disparity and cost if you restrict the numbers.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brad Lovelace. Yeah. So I would recommend being very careful about restricting numbers, because we have a very good tradition of basing harvest numbers on the best science that we have. And I would caution us against using that to discourage people from hunting, right? Because we want to encourage that. There are things that other states have done to restrict numbers. And so as opposed to, I mean, we could raise prices, and we've done that for non-residents, but some states, and it's been referenced in here by some of the comments we've had, have a system where non-residents need to apply. It's not over the counter for waterfowl, right? South Dakota is one they mentioned where you regulate that and you limit the number of non-residents that can come in. So that's a step to very clearly make decisions about limiting that and trying to reestablish this balance. The one thing I would encourage us to do is, again, we should follow the good science. We saw some numbers for a few years tonight where we talked about the trends towards some increasing numbers of non-resident waterfowlers. But I would encourage us to have the staff dig back, and I'll promise we'll do that if that's what you'd like. Past years, look at these trends, compare with what other states are doing in terms of their trends and their management practices and limitations like we've discussed tonight, and try to figure out what works and what doesn't, what's a factor of COVID and the increases we've seen around versus if there's a long-term trend going on in Kansas to the questions that were raised. So we can provide numbers about that, and we're glad to do that analysis for the next meeting. And that's what we're good at. And I recommend that you allow us to do that background checking and then provide that to you for discussion next time, if that's all right.
Well, and that's fine with me. I just think it's a real problem, and I don't really have an answer. Warren, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say that I don't dispute that it's not a problem. It's clearly an issue, and we're getting a lot of feedback. And the idea of needing more information, I would support, because I'm here kind of two primary themes around non-resident. One is that non-residents are and outfitters who cater to non-residents are leasing up or controlling a lot of the private land, which is kind of driving residents to the need to hunt on public lands, which puts more support there. But then we also hear that non-residents are also flooding the public lands as well. And I'm not sure if it's both or if it's one or the other. And that would be really helpful to me to begin to get some sort of a handle on that, so we know just which problem is more acute and which one, to help establish priority.
Troy, from your experience, is there a lot of guides in the middle of this that are making it worse?
The guides are certainly part of the issue. They're coming up from, I heard the story that, the guides out of Great Bend were scouting clear out around Ness and Trego County. And I know there's some more guides in the Kerwin, Norton, Alma, Nebraska area that are coming in, new guides that weren't there in past years. But yeah, it's just one aspect of, the state of Kansas has always been proud of the fact that, our outdoor experiences are really good, and they are. And that's why all of a sudden we're experiencing the problems we are. And I just, the suggestions that I brought up about reducing limits, increasing fees, limiting the amount of days they can hunt, we got to start someplace, and it's not going to end. These out-of-state guys are coming into these reservoirs and they're hunting daylight to dark. They don't let the birds rest. And when they're not hunting, they're hunting for a place to hunt. When we hunt the water, we hunt till 10:30 and pack it up and let the birds get back in there and let them get rested up so we can have a quality shoot the next day. These guys aren't doing that. They are not respecting the outdoors the way the Kansans have. And that's my biggest pet peeve about the whole thing is they're really not playing fair. They're just not. It's just, you just feel like you've lost what you had. And I'm concerned that if we don't start something and do something, we're going to get bombarded again next year and the year after that. And when Missouri tightens up their days, when Missouri says, well, you can only hunt, out of state can only hunt so many days, we're talking about people from the Carolinas, Tennessee. There was a group of hunters that hunted Cedar Bluff from Louisiana and Texas, and they were there from Thanksgiving to the end of the season. That's a lot of days of hunting public and private. They put a lot of pressure on our resource.
Primarily brought in by guides.
You can't tell. You really can't. you know, as Chris mentioned, yeah, you would like to think that 4 jacked up pickups and 4 big old long trailers full of decoys, and they're just guys like me. You know, I'm not going to say that. I don't know, but they sure got a lot of equipment, and they all got a lot of nice stuff, and they sure got a lot of time off.
Secretary Lovelace, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Brad Lovelace. One other comment I should make, and I appreciate the sentiments of the commissioners and the public that have commented. One other thing to bear in mind is we think about solutions. We need to think about the economic impact, because if legislators were on this call, they would be bringing that up. How are the changes that you're proposing going to affect the livelihoods of the people that depend on it? And they won't be thinking about non-resident guides. They'll be thinking about people that run the hotel and the private campground and people that are selling dinners to these folks. So that's one thing just to bear in mind as we talk about solutions that work for everybody. We have to think about that impact too as part of it.
Yeah, but this is Commissioner Spohr. At what point are you going to protect the resource?
Right.
At what point is it overran and there's not a resource there?
Oh.
What happens when all the pheasants are gone and all the deer are gone and there's no ducks because what about the resident hunters, the 14-year-old kid that wants to go out and do a little hunting and there's no hunting to be had? At what point do you got to protect the resource?
Right.
And I just seen so much of it this year that it's just unbearable to see what they've done to the area. And yeah, sure, they bring a lot of money in there, but at what point will we just start putting up bird pens and raising birds like South Dakota?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. To be sustainable, again, Secretary Lovelace, we have to balance all that out. But I just don't want us to be naive about the feedback we'll get from legislators. So we have to come up with a sustainable solution that works for the long run. So I think we're all on the same page, but I know what we'll hear from the legislature when it comes to their concerns. So just wanted you all to be aware of that.
Well, why don't staff think about this and let's have this discussion at the next meeting?
We'll do that.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary, I know Tom Brodowski has a lot of information on the number of non-residents, the number of those that have purchased the state waterfowl stamp. Our public land staff have the check-in system, the iSportsman. They can give us some good figures on the numbers, and that's a good place to start. Just for information, I looked up the statute. Our fee cap on non-resident hunting license is $125. We're at $95 right now, so.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Gefeller, are you suggesting a waterfowl only look or a deer and waterfowl? Because those are the two areas that I get most of the feedback. I'm mostly deer because I'm not a waterfowl hunter, and waterfowl is kind of a new issue this year anyway. But can we look at both the situations?
Mr. Chair. Yeah, Commissioner Gefeller, we certainly can. Remember, we do have limits. We have caps on those non-resident deer permits, and we run into those each year. That's one of the big differences that Commissioner Spohr is pointing out. We don't have any caps on those non-resident waterfowl permits that we allow. And so that's why a year like this year, the numbers can swing way high. One of the things to think about, though, is the resource. And another factor, right? You folks aren't naive to this. We have a deer herd that really resides almost completely in Kansas. We got waterfowl that are just passing through. This another, Assistant Secretary Miller mentioned earlier about some of the kind of anomalous factors. Besides COVID this year, the northern border to Canada being closed, some hurricane problems really affected habitat down in the Gulf states, that typically are big waterfowl areas. So some interesting things going on, but still, it would be naive for us to dismiss this as a function of all those things and not look to long-term trends like Commissioner Spohr is pointing out. So we'll be glad to give you those numbers and bolster a healthy conversation on this going forward. We have lots to think about because we do have to look out for our resident hunters and those concerns about R3, the things we've been talking about, bringing in people, allowing our young people to have a quality hunt and experience and start to nurture them. Critical aspect to our long-term planning. So we agree.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Spoor again, and I'm not saying that we need to go out on a big limb. I'm just saying that we as a commission need to start thinking about not allowing non-residents in on special hunts. Youth and veterans, non-resident youth and veterans probably shouldn't be able to participate in special hunts and be part of the mentor, not be allowed to go into a mentor area. Changing the limits a little bit. The goose hunters around all say that 6 Canada geese is too much. And I agree. The outfitters sure like that 6. Everybody I talk to say that 3 is a good number. There's just things, go ahead and take the non-resident from 99 to 125. That's not a big deal. Everybody's going to pay $26 and you're still going to have the same amount. Maybe you start limiting how many days they can they can hunt in the state. There's things that we can do that's not gonna raise the eyebrows of the legislature. I guess there's small tweaks that we need to start doing to protect what we have, or we won't have it. And I'm not asking for a lot. I think that we need to start really looking at this.
Okay. We'll review this at the next meeting. It'll come back. Is there anything else that comes before the commission tonight? Well, have a good night. Meeting is adjourned.
See ya.